right? To understand how cinema has changed, how media have changed, and how our relationships are therefore much more complicated now, right? In terms of vulnerability and control, or activity and passivity. So I think you're absolutely right to chew on, think more about that, right? We could go around and make each person ask. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. We can try it for the rest of the semester. Johnny, and you're with you. Jenny's trying to for me. Oh,
I have a very simple question.
Okay.
And then I kind of saw a excessive optimism in this Queer Eye
Yeah.
episode. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then is that a part of the functions of melodrama?
Yeah.
Is that a part of the genre? And then how does it function?
Yeah.
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 And the second question.
Yeah.
And does it have a political agenda?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's this one. So, yeah.
Yeah. Those are good questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of excess is at the heart of body genres, right? And the way that, can I talk about the Williamses, then they've all understood it, right? Okay, so the way that Williams takes us through this problem is to say that these three in particular, melodrama, horror, and pornography, all have an excessive textual manifestation, and that it's opposed to, so these three guys are all about excess, and the excess is measured against classical Hollywood cinema, right? So this is the kind of history that she's trying to help us think about in relation particularly to melodrama, which is her sort of overarching interest in that essay. But she's written a great deal about pornography and about horror. And so she's sort of saying that in all three of these genres, we see textual excess that's working against the conventions of classical Hollywood cinema. And the conventions of classical Hollywood cinema are action-centered, goal-oriented, protagonist-driven, strong orientation, a sense of orientation, strong closure, right? All of these elements of narrative cinema that congeal in the early 20th century and that really characterize film storytelling for many, many, many decades. And that these three, plus the musical, right, the Hollywood musical, have moments when we're disoriented, when there's editing that's based on principles other than goal orientation of a protagonist, or the action, cause and effect, chain of relationships that characterizes narrative. So when you are watching a melodrama and all of a sudden the narrative stops and you're just looking at Dorothy Malone's red dress for seconds and seconds and seconds. Nothing's happening, it's just a red dress. And you're thinking, what? films don't usually do this. They don't usually just stop and have us look at dresses, right? There's usually a reason we're looking at the dress, like someone's gonna buy a dress, right? There's some action associated with it. Or when we usually watch movies, people don't just start singing, right? There's a reason that they sing, right? They don't just burst into song and dance, right? But there are these elements of these genres that work what she calls against narrative, right? So there's a tension for her always between these two poles of excess and narrative. And you all know what that looks like because you say, huh? Why did that guy do that? Right? Or why is this happening? Or why are we seeing this? That's excess, right? That's when something else, and Rick Altman, when she quotes Rick Altman in that essay, calls it another logic, right? Is peeping up somehow in the film, and you're seeing it at work in tension with narrative, right? So the idea of excessive sentiment, right, is part of this idea of excess more generally. There's visual excess, there's oral, right, excess. There are many, many forms of excess, but sentiment, right, is one form, right? Overwrought emotion, too much, sobbing, right? Anguished weeping. Long periods of time where what you're seeing is emotion rather than action, goal-oriented movement, cause and effect relationships, all the things that narrative is built on. So for Williams, she's trying to give us a formal way to think about excess, not just as a lot of feeling, right, but as a structure in its own right that works in tension with classical ways of modes of storytelling associated with film form. And that's been why she's been reluctant, as of all the people who've come after her, just to talk about sentimentality. Because she's trying to talk about form, about at the level of how films are put together and what they put emphasis on, right? That you can see excess formally as well as understand it emotionally, right? So I think that that's a very valuable contribution, and it's one that I mentioned earlier Eugenie Brinkma takes up in the form of the affects, because she wants to think about, like, how do you actually see it, right? And in that moment in the psycho shower scene, she says you see it in that tear that's not motivated narratively, right? You see it in these visual details where you're like, what's that? Why are we looking at that? Where did that come from? How is she crying? She's dead. And so she says, oh, it's that moment that should call our attention to all these questions of inside, outside that Psycho is all about, right? So I'd say in response to your first question, that the idea of excess is not just sentiment or overwrought emotion, but it's formal. And there's something really, really productive about following that route. The answer to the second question is yes, absolutely, this film has a political, or this series has a political mission. And the mission is racial reconciliation, structured in a production company rooted in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the center of Black American television. It's where most Black American television is now made. It is not made in Hollywood. It is made in Atlanta, Georgia. And so there's a whole Tyler Perry, everything about Black American culture is rooted in Atlanta, Georgia, in the production infrastructure there. And so this is emerging from that in order to address head-on the experiences of racial division in the American South from the perspective of queer remediation. So I would say yes, absolutely. It has a very overt political mission, which is to try and tackle that. And some of the guys, some of the Fab Five are Southerners, and they address that in a way that's very explicit. So American regionalism is very much part of what they're up to. And that's not something actually that is talked about in relation to this series very much. Your question makes me think that that's something to sort of unfold and think more about, because it is kind of a national phenomenon, right? It's on a big platform, you can watch it here. So it's internet, it has a reach beyond the US, but it is rooted in that. So it's a very helpful question. Thank you.
Can I have another?
Yeah.
Yeah. This episode kind of reminded me the experience while I watched This Is Us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very famous melodrama 2 years ago, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
Now it's kind of
Yeah.
yeah. And then I dropped it because I feel a sentimental fatigue.
Yeah.
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 So how can we deal with this one?
Yeah.
This fatigue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting response, because it's the exact opposite phenomenon with Queer Eye that interests me. It's about sentimental, almost upping the stakes, right? The winners of the sentimental game are the most sentimental, right? There's this sort of celebration of the most emotional bits, right? The most heightened emotionality in this series. And I think that, one of the things I've been struggling to think about in the past decade, maybe 15 years, with regard to television, is that it's an incredibly fragmented landscape, right? There's no longer centralized platforms. We're mostly watching whatever we access and whatever interests us. There's very little shared culture. It's very difficult to find something that we all have seen and are invested in. And so it's hard to have conversations about common cultural objects. And so your fatigue might be someone else's pleasure. It's very hard to measure. There's very little critical consensus around the televisual landscape. And things are able to persist even with very small audiences, right? So if you experience fatigue, it does not mean the end of This Is Us. It's just you keep going, right? And your response in that regard isn't calibrated into the future of that program, but a different kind of sentimentality or a different kind of emotional engagement might actually be more appealing to you, right? So there's a kind of trafficking in emotion that's changing all the time in the production of serial episodic forms. And that phenomenon of binging, right, or too much, right, is actually very pleasurable to some people, right? So again, when I was talking about those poles of activity and passivity, the poles of pleasure and pain are not straightforward either, right? Never have been, but are particularly complicated, I think, in today's media landscape. So that's the best I can do. I don't like This Is Us very much, so sorry about that. I too was taken by it and then gave up. So, yeah.
I was thinking about the question of temporality
Yeah.
and how it could be discussed with the cases and disorders.
Yeah.
Because in, for example, in Williams and others discussion of melodrama,
Yeah.
when we talk about temporality, we talk about, the temporality of instruments or for instances,
Yeah.
any kind of, or other forms.
Yeah.
That and also in your in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned binge watching,
Yeah.
right? So I just wonder how these are related to
Yeah.
the structure of access
Yeah.
in queer eye, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that Linda Williams is a really, really astute theorist of cinema and a really, really bad thinker about TV. And I think it's entirely generational. She was brought up thinking about film and about degraded film forms, and that's her education as a feminist theorist. And so that discussion of temporality in the essay that you all read is fantastic. Insofar as it corresponds to these three forms, her discussion of fantasy as regulating that temporality is fantastic. And she has no idea how to deal with episodic or serial forms. So I'm interested in this question of fatigue, is a great example of the production of affect around seriality, right? Or the production of expectation around episodic structures that are fulfilled by binge watching, right? The reason you can't stop is that it's structured as serial form, as episodic serial form, and it creates expectations that have to be satisfied by going to the next episode. And you gotta find out what happens. Right? And the only closure comes at the end of a season. And now it doesn't even matter what a season is. A season can be whatever you decide it is. I say a season's 8 episodes. Boom, here you go. Right? And you can write differently arcs over those 8 episodes. The whole production landscape has changed. So I think that the question of temporality is vital, but temporality has completely transformed with digital platforms. So sure, you can think about the structure of a 2-hour movie as much as you'd like, but that's all that we know what that looks like. Right? But we do not know what the structure of a 72-year run of a soap opera is. 72 years. Right? That's a different kind of temporality. Right? Or writing, if any of you are ever going to write media, right? Now you don't write a pilot. You don't write 1 episode and give it to some guys and say, hey, what do you think? You write 12, right? Because you have the capacity to tell a story now over a much longer form. And that changes the temporal structure of what we're seeing. It also changes our consumption of it. Right? So I think the questions have really shifted. That it's not just about taking these forms and seeing them, and you were great about that, by the way, right? That one thing is that we know that these genres have migrated, right? But they've also changed as they've migrated, and they've changed temporally. So I think we have to ask different questions about the reality that she has there.
And also I would like to share my thoughts about, I was really struck by the faithful, about the trans men,
Yes.
who received the operation.
Yes.
And in all these clips that we watched, it seems to me that is the one that is concerned with the question of body the most,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But it is also the least dramatic.
Yes. Yeah. I think that clip actually transfers the drama from what the trans man is experiencing in surgery, because he's unconscious and then he's coming out of a general anesthetic. And if you've ever had surgery, you know that coming out of a general anesthetic is like being in a fog. You don't know what's going on, right? You don't, who knows what, if you even experience what they attribute to him. But the drama is transferred to the Fab Five as spectators.
Right.
And it's their affect that we're reading, right? And it's actually one of the more pedagogical moments, because the introduction to that sequence is, here we're watching someone have top surgery, and then Tam says, oh, that's when the breasts are removed, right? To explain it to the audience. That rarely happens on Queer Eye. Mostly we're presumed to know what's happening. And this is a moment where they say, this is actually what this means, and this is what's happening. And then we're watching their faces respond to a presumed revelation that's happening in the operating room, but it probably isn't, right? And they're the ones who are responding, right, and who are affirming it. I think that's inspirational. Right? Can you imagine being in the body and deciding to have this dramatic change happen? It's so, there's a moment when actually the drama shifts to them in an unusual way. It's part of the structure of the series that they watch on screen all together the final revelation. So it is about that reverse shot very frequently, but in this this montage, this compilation, they really highlight that. Yeah. I think that the series is very uncomfortable with trans issues, and feels that it needs to incorporate everything that's queer, but doesn't quite know how to do it.
And how did the trans communities respond to this?
Lukewarm. Lukewarm. Yeah, like not, there wasn't anger, there wasn't, kind of sense of yay. It was just kind of lukewarm. Yeah. I think because there's been so much other trans material on television with Orange is the New Black and Transparent Parent, I think that displaced a little bit of the attention onto this. Is there any trans TV in Taiwan?
People watch RuPaul.
RuPaul.
In the gay community.
Yeah. Yeah.
They always cry in RuPaul.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the work.
Maybe more tears.
Yes. Yeah. And RuPaul's another example. There's a new book coming out that I was asked to blurb on RuPaul and philosophy. That's kind of an interesting take, right? Like, how do you philosophize about RuPaul's Drag Race? But one of the things that became really clear is the figure of RuPaul herself as the center of that sort of universe. Whereas I think the Fab Five, that gets dispersed a little bit. It's not just one figure, and not particularly charismatic. I mean, they're all charismatic, but it's not as centralized around that figure and around the format of competition, of reality show competition, and the sort of, the traffic of queenly banter that surrounds RuPaul. It's a very different structure.
Can I? As a spectator, sometimes I feel, when I feel this is too much or this is excess,
Yeah.
And that means that I'm restraining my emotions, my sentiments.
Yes.
Yeah, probably I feel this is too feminine. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
cisgendered.
Yes.
Or probably I think I should keep some degree of social decency.
Yes.
Yes, and then also I think I can apply this restrainment to like personal relationship.
Yes.
And stop being a drama queen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sort of that, yeah.
Yeah.
So my question would be like, I got some ideas, but I really want your opinions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why we feel this necessity to restrain ourselves?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I think you answered it yourself in some ways, that we police ourselves in relation to lots of different norms, right? So, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about Queer Eyes around masculinity and around the limits of vulnerability or the revelation of vulnerability by men. And so it's interesting that you feel sort of overly feminized, right? When you're caught in emotion in that way. So our sense of what it means to be gendered is so rooted in emotional norms and in the display of emotion according to gendered logics, that when we transgress, we become very aware of the logics that are governing us, right? So this whole question of inside-outside is very interesting. Like, when does that become palpable? That you realize that you're living in a system of norms. It's when you go beyond them, right? When you're in public and all of a sudden you start weeping and you think, I shouldn't do this here. This is not appropriate. And you restrain and recompose, and the outside, the exterior, the mask goes back in place, right? And whatever's in there goes back down, right? Or you have some adjudication of that. But I would say that there are modes of excess that are not entirely about our conscious ability to modulate, right? And that those are the formal modes of access that I was talking about before, right? So that we can become attentive to the red dress, which is from, do you know this? It's from a Douglas Sirk film that is quite spectacular. All of Douglas Sirk is about, he's a great director of melodrama. And it's all about freezing the narrative and watching the red dress, right? Or freezing the narrative and watching a prop that becomes phallic. Or freezing the narrative and watching someone driving wildly through the night, right? Whatever that visual material is, it gets us in a way that's not just about deciding, but about refocusing our attention and our embodied engagement with visual and oral elements in cinema, right? So there is this capacity that film has of directing our attention when we're not making conscious decisions. I'll give you an example. In most action movies, you have a protagonist, he's running around with a gun somewhere, and then there's an intertitle that says, London. And somehow, from wherever you were running around with your gun, you're now in London. And then there's more running around with guns, and then it says Athens. And you say, oh, now we're in Athens, running around with a gun, and then it says Taipei. And now we're running around with it. Right? Any Bourne movie, this is what happens, right? Any contemporary action movie. And you don't say, hey, I'm not going to Athens. I never planned to be in Athens with you. I'm staying in London. Right? You just go where the movie takes you. You're on a rooftop. You don't say, how did we get on the rooftop? It's impossible to be on this rooftop. You just go, right? And that's how cinema's realm of imagination works. It takes you. And sometimes you might say, I'm not going there. Right? But mostly you're swept up and you go. Wherever the text takes you. It might take you to a red dress, it might take you to Athens, it might take you to a cause and effect chase sequence, but you will go. And you will likely go if it's dark and nobody's looking at you. Right? You're much more likely to say, okay, take me. Right? So there are very interesting questions about these phenomena of spectatorship that I think transcend